what's going on? I'm Travis with Proselytize or Apostatize, and I'm here with a very special guest. His name is Jadon, and he's with Confident Faith. And so, Jadon, it's really good to have you on here. And if you want
Thanks
to
for having
take a
me.
minute, yeah, absolutely. If you want to kind of introduce yourself, tell us, what it is you do, about your
Mhm.
channel, and things of that nature.
Yeah, so my channel name is Confident Faith. I started it mostly as a hobby. I just got into apologetics, and I was learning a lot of justifications for what I've already believed, because I grew up in a Christian household and at home, but
Right.
um, I started actually looking at why I actually believe what I believe, and I had a big burden for that. And I wanted other believers to be able to know that they can trust in our faith with confidence and not have to waver, and that actually intellectually understand what we believe. So the whole
Hmm.
goal of the channel is to help Christians have confidence in our faith, and have confidence when sharing faith with other people, and have confidence when you're facing objections to be able to talk with them. And part of that, some people, I've had some people, atheists, say that's like arrogance to say that we can have confidence in our faith.
Hmm.
That's not to say that you can't, like, because part of learning is there's going to be times where you're doubting, there's going to be times where you don't have the answers, and that's what
Sure.
fuels you to get the answers. But at the end of the day, I think Christians can have confidence in their faith, and that's really the whole goal of it.
Yeah, and so that's kind of perfect segue into like what we're going to be
Mhm.
discussing today, which is the importance of natural theology, theistic arguments, apologetics, and things of
Mhm.
that sort. And so I'm a person. I actually came into faith through arguments. It was
Mhm.
things like the contingency and the fine tuning argument are kind of what convinced me that God exists, because
Yeah.
I know for me, like I needed to kind of see the idea of God existing as coherent before I could even consider something like Christianity, Judaism, something like that.
Mhm.
And so for me, it kind of hits close to home because it's the way I came into the faith.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so one thing that I did kind of want to start with is there tends to be among like fundamentalists and things of that sort, this sort of pushback or rejection of
Mhm.
natural theology. What are your thoughts on that? That maybe it's
Mhm.
unnecessary, it's secular. What do you think of the Christian pushback on natural
Yeah,
theology?
so I think mostly it comes down to, there's multiple reasons, but one of them ideally is just the misunderstanding of apologetics. They don't
Hmm.
understand what apologetics is, or what it's actually used for, or how it can actually further the gospel. And a second reason, which has to do a little bit with ignorance, is the movement anti-intellectualism, which is, especially in
Yeah,
fundamentalist circles, is a
right,
very
right.
prominent. I think that's a big reason they reject apologetics. It mostly just in my experience, when I've talked with people who disagree with apologetics or thought it was unbiblical, it was
Hmm.
usually an emotional response to it. Either that, or they just honestly had no prior engagement with it, and they just kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, just assuming.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. And as we kind of get into this, let me ask you, what are some of your favorite theistic arguments?
Some of my favorite theistic arguments,
Hmm.
probably I had to say the Kalam, which some people might say that's like the
Mm.
most basic as far as apologetics. William Lane Craig is very
Oh,
popular among
okay.
apologists, but I think the Kalam is very good, useful. It's very useful because it's very simple. It's only like
Mhm.
only 3 points arguments. But there's very many implications you can make from that. Like a lot of atheists will say the Kalam doesn't say God in it, so how can you use it as an argument for God? Which they are
Right.
right. It doesn't say God, but the implications from if the universe does have a cause, like the logical conclusions, I think, and many people would agree, is that it shows at least that there is a first cause.
Oh
So that
yeah,
one,
yeah.
go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, I was going to ask you if you've heard of Andrew Loke's version of the Clum. I think it's really good because
I've heard
instead of
of it,
saying,
but I'm not familiar with it.
well, he kind of goes the route that perhaps instead of saying the universe had a beginning, that there's
Mm,
a metaphysical beginning. That
mm,
it's more philosophical and like independent of certain like theories of time, or the
yeah,
universe and cosmology and
yeah,
everything.
because with the Kalam, Craig spends a lot of time in his book just addressing the different views, because there are many different views on times and that stuff, and a lot of people will try to say that maybe the universe is eternal, and you have to deal with that. And in my experience, when I've used the Kalam to engage with people, they will say, the universe, why can the universe be eternal? And usually that's just a
Mhm.
like they'll bring up the whole like who made God type of thing, which that's
Yeah.
Logically, it's not a defeater for Christian faith at all. Like, so you can reason with them, but that's been like a obstacle you definitely have to get over. And I could see how
Mhm.
Lope's argument can kind of, cut to the chase a little bit. So that's good. I'll have to research that a lot more. But
I like it because he kind of even deduces properties that the
yeah,
first cause would have. Like it would need
mm,
to be intelligent to bring about a highly ordered universe. He would
mm,
have to be the first, which is beginningless, and so it's a really interesting like metaphysical defense of Craig's
mm,
original argument. So yeah, but I guess
yeah,
like for me, I've always been a fan of the contingency arguments because
yes,
it's
yes,
like
I love
even
that.
if there is an infinite causal set, that doesn't explain why there is an infinite causal set, and that God
Mm,
would offer the best explanation of why there is that even in the first place. So
mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think the contingency I think it faces less hurdles.
Yeah, I love the contingency. And when you brought it up, I think now like the reason the contingency is so helpful and so useful and like engaging with people is just it seems to me at least and very intuitive, that at some
Yeah,
point there has to be a first cause, and there's
right,
so many different variations of the contingency, so you can point out
right.
certain specific aspects of what you're trying to argue for.
Yeah, I like Rasmussen's the best. The
Yes, yep.
explanatory principle.
Mm,
I think is really good. So, what do you think of art? Like, say, let's talk about arguments from miracles. In fact,
mm,
hopefully, Caleb will be joining us because that's one of his favorite is the argument from miracles. But
yeah.
what's your take on that? I kind of have mixed views, to be honest.
Are you talking about like because the resurrection is I think the biggest miracle we can argue from, but are you talking about like from more personal experiences or like in what?
Right. Yeah. The argument for miracles, like miraculous claims that,
Yeah.
in fact, even Richard Swinburne, kind of defends this too, that, in a God created universe, it would be it would be more probable that there are these miraculous interventions at times
Yeah.
and everything.
Yeah, so I think miraculous arguments from miracles are very helpful, and the reason
Mm.
is a lot of times whenever you are speaking, especially with the atheist, and they will bring up the fact that even if God did exist, like let's say God does exist, they grant to you that yeah, he's immaterial, so you can't um, expect to find him in the material world. You can because I think I'm gonna get there, but as far as like science is a tool, but it's not the best tool to study God because God would be immaterial, and science doesn't
Mhm.
deal in that as far as right now. So miracles are kind of that point to where the supernatural and the physical like merge, and you actually can look into it because a lot of times they would say, "Yeah, I do grant to you that science may not be able to tell us certain questions about God or
Right.
answer certain questions about God,
Yeah.
but if he did exist, it would make sense that we would find interventions throughout
Yeah.
time."
Yeah.
And the fact that we can use miracles to actually show that, I think would be strong for theism. Personally, I haven't devoted a lot of time to studying arguments for miracles other than the
Mhm.
resurrection, which like I said, I think is the greatest miracle that we could point to. But yeah,
Oh, absolutely. In fact, now that you mentioned the resurrection, what sort of a approach do you favor? Like sort of a minimal facts,
yeah, the middle facts,
rational?
just because
Okay,
I've just gotten into, because for those of you who don't know, like my channel, is very new. And I've been apologetics now, like actively like studying it for like a year and a half now.
oh, okay,
But the goal of my channel is not like to me be like a guru to where I'm like preaching at you like this is like what you should do. It's mostly
right.
just like I've learned stuff and I'm just sharing like thoughts. It's almost like a very healthy environment to where we just value truth. And because of that, I just wanted to say that David Paulman with his channel is Faith Theory, Faith Because of Reason.
Right, right.
He really helped me as far as getting into apologetics, and now I'm starting to like study specific like fields to kind of like bone up on certain specifics, and I'm actually trying to do that with the resurrection. But as far as right now, the main approach I use is the minimal facts approach because it's very
Mhm.
intuitive. It's very it's something you both can point to, like this is our common ground, we both can
Sure.
agree on this, and then you can make implications from that. And I think that it's really helpful to do it that way.
Yeah. So let me ask you, how do you think it's affected? Because you're talking about your faith and everything.
Hmm.
Do you think apologetics has really strengthened like your personal
Hmm.
relationship in your walk with Christ?
Yeah, so when I first got into apologetics, the way I explain it is I accepted Christ, like I got saved when I was 12, And I
Okay.
knew what I believed, but up until that point, I didn't have a very strong justification for why I believed what I believed. And most of that is just because in certain like evangelical circles, it's pushed that like um, to have justification is to abandon faith, which we can get into that now. And that's really the reason my channel is named Confident Faith, to bring awareness to that, like I mentioned. But for me, the more I strengthen my walk with God intellectually, which just to throw this in there, it, growing intellectually is part of the spiritual walk. It's not that like you grow
Oh
intellectually,
yeah.
but you're abandoning the spiritual life. Like growing intellectually is part of the spiritual life. It says that, and I think Luke, I can't remember, Luke 10, can't remember the specific passage where the greatest commandments to love God with your mind. But as I
Oh,
grew intellectually, my faith grew so much more, and like my relationship with Christ grew so much deeper. It was much more rich because it had more substance. It wasn't just feeling. Which the role of the Holy Spirit is very important, and but the Holy
mhm.
Spirit can use your intellectual life to minister to you. So my
Yeah.
faith has only increased since I started studying. And I think it would make sense because the Bible commands us to grow intellectually.
Yeah, I think that's so important because I've noticed the same thing with myself. Like I have two
Mm.
aspects. Like I like studying, natural theology,
Yeah.
specifically how it relates to science and science
Mhm.
faith issues. But what I'm most involved in is outreach ministry to the
Mhm.
homeless. Like I'm with our calling here in Dallas.
That's awesome.
That does that sort of outreach, and it's like there kind of seems to be this misconception, that the intellectual aspect, has
Mhm.
nothing to do with the practical aspect of like
Yeah.
evangelism and
Mm.
outreach, and I think that's just such a myth that
Mhm.
you know
Yeah.
I'm involved in both, and I think
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, kind of like you were saying, like the more I learn and study, and the more confident I am in my faith,
Mhm.
the I think the better at evangelism I am.
Exactly, and I think, like, as Christians, we're called to be Christ-like, to be more like Christ, and Christ was the, like, personification, I think, the best, like, personification we have of the intellectual with the spiritual. Like, Jesus spiritually ministered to people and he said he was moved with compassion. So, some people there's a misconception that to grow your intellectual life is to, like, abandon the emotional. People, like, they view emotionalism as, like, weakness and stuff, which it can be, but at
Mhm.
the same time, intellectualism, when it's in a wrong form, can also be toxic. So Jesus is the perfect middle ground to where he incorporated the intellectual with the spiritual, and that's exactly like that. That's personified in your life as well through Christ. You have a good, strong intellectual life with God, but at the same time, through that, and because of that, you understand the importance of reaching people emotionally. And even me, I've had to work on that
Absolutely.
too because um, some people, they are going to have intellectual objections, and we're called to address those. We research a lot on how to address those. But also, some people have sometimes purely emotional objections, and sometimes
Yeah.
some intellectual arguments not going to help them. You have to be wise as serpents, harmless as doves, as Christ said. You have to be able to, it's case by case. But all of that
Absolutely.
is apologetics related.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's why I really don't get this pushback that
Hmm.
there seems to be. Like from like kind of like you were saying, the more like independent fundamentalist Baptist kind of crowd and everything.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, because that's the movement I grew up in, and I face a
oh,
lot of pushback as far as whether it was biblical or not, which surprised me. But it was fruitful in the end because it forced me to actually like show why fundamentally we should even engage in apologetics. But
right,
it was kind of irritating at first, but I think again it was a
yeah.
big result of just the whole anti-intellectual movement that's been going on.
Oh yeah. And so kind of speaking of that, what do you think of using apologetics as a means of evangelism?
Yeah.
I know that's a little bit controversial. So
Mhm.
what's your take on that? I happen to be in favor of it.
Yeah, me as well. So the main goal of the Christian, as far as a church, is to reach others with the gospel. Like, yes, we need to grow spiritually. There's outreach stuff is part of that and all that stuff, but essentially the end goal um, is to preach the gospel to every creature. And I think apologetics is a tool that we use to be able to do that. Apologetics, I mean, in the Bible, 1 Peter 3:15, we're commanded to give an answer for the reason that is in us. And the best example I love to use to show how evangelism and apologetics are one-on-one, it's an example that Eric Hernandez always uses, which is really helpful to me, is in 2 Corinthians 10, it talks about how Christians were supposed to tear down strongholds and anything that brings itself against the knowledge of Christ, tearing down imaginations. And a lot of people misunderstand that verse. They preach it as far as if you have a problem with this sin, God, Christ, you're supposed to tear that down. And it can relate to that, but the context as a whole is spiritual warfare, which would involve evangelism. There's a warfare going on in the world of evangelism. And let's say someone you knock on a door, if you do it that way, or let's say you meet someone in the streets, or let's say it's as a whole, the church corporately sees a problem, atheism would be considered a stronghold. There's different views like naturalism, scientism. Those are all strongholds that can hinder someone from coming to the knowledge of Christ. We're commanded by the Bible and we're commanded by God to tear down those strongholds. And part of that is using reason and arguments for God's existence if it has to do with God, So I think that passage really sets in stone the need for both at the same time.
Right. And so what's your favorite apologetic methodology? You have presuppositional apologetics, evidential apologetics, cumulative case. I happen to be a big proponent of the cumulative case. I think that's the best way to go. But what's your view on that?
Yeah, so me right now, I would put myself in the cumulative case camp. And the reason is because there's really no, in my experience, there's no one argument that just completely ends every objection as far as, for example, I had a discussion with Tom Jump, which this is, if you go and watch it, you can see how my knowledge then, there's stuff he brought up that I didn't know I necessarily had to address at the time. And that's, I showed that it was just, I think it was great to be able to show that, is because the whole goal of the channel is to help Christians grow, and I'm growing with you. And some of you might disagree with that, but because of that, I studied it out. So the cumulative case, let's say you bring up one argument, let's say the kalam, and you show that there is a first cause. That doesn't get you necessarily to Christianity. And if we're talking in the context of evangelism, you would need to get to Christ as far as to reach the world, the gospel. So the first cause, showing that there's a first cause, or showing that there is a unmoved mover, that along with the argument for the resurrection, or that along the argument for miracles, builds a very cumulative case, a very helpful case. Versus just one argument, because a lot of times one argument won't get you to Christianity, and that's why some people have objected to apologetics, which we can talk about that in a little bit if you want. But mostly the cumulative case approach is one I like to use.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one reason I favor the cumulative case is because you can kind of meet people where they're at. Let's say somebody's struggling with something the problem of evil. Why does God seem so far removed from our suffering? Is he indifferent to it and everything? And so you can bring up certain theodicies and everything. Or maybe somebody's well, I've heard these mythicists say that Jesus might not even have existed. In fact, it sounds like a lot of the pagan a recapitulation of the pagan deities, like the Horus and everything. And so you can kind of meet them on that level. Or maybe they have scientific objections. You hit them with things like the fine tuning and argument from mathematics and things like that. So that's one thing I really like about it, is its ability to kind of meet people where they're at.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really like I said, at the end of the day, the bedrock of everything we do Christian related is just Christ at the center. That's why the resurrection is so important. But yeah, that's what Christ did. He met them where they're at. So that's great that you incorporate that.
So I guess one thing that might be interesting to kind of focus on is, what do you think of the rejection on the atheistic side, that apologetics is just all the arguments are bogus, none of them work, there's just no evidence for God, and things of that sort. You're just trying to justify your irrational beliefs. What's your take on all of that?
Yeah, so I think
we'll put it in terms of I guess at first the new atheist type objection.
Yeah, so as far as a new atheist, that context really helps. And the new atheists, a lot of times the new atheists, they just completely they assume the intention behind the apologist. That's why they say it's all bogus arguments. You're just trying to hide the fact that you don't know what you believe. You're just trying to like use arguments to make yourself look like you guys have all the answers, but you really don't. Like you guys are just, it's still just, blind faith. And I think the way you could really exemplify that is the fact how atheists will, even after you explain what Christians actually believe, you literally explain to them, this is the Christian statement of faith. They'll still strawman you. A perfect example is, I don't know if you watched the debate with Aaron Ra and Michael Jones.
Yes,
Yes, and
yes,
Eric Hernandez.
that was classic.
Yeah. So Michael Jones continually defined what faith was biblically. The word used for faith is pistis, which means confidence or trust, right? And Aaron Ra continually after that point was saying how faith is blind. Like faith is what you guys use when you don't have all the answers and you guys think you have it all figured out. He didn't say those exact words. I'm not quoting him, but that's essentially what he said. And you can go watch the debate yourself. And then Eric Hernandez during the comments, the Q&A, he went and pressed Aaron Ra. Why is it that after we define what Christian faith, what our statement of faith is, you continue to misrepresent? And I think that's a perfect example to show how a lot of times they assume the intention behind the believer, and they think the arguments are just a front, just to cover that up. And not every new atheist is like this, but I'm saying that's the biggest, as far as like the online community, because that's a big community as far as new atheists. Is in the online community, you'll see a lot of strawmans, a lot of misrepresentations, and also just the misunderstanding of apologetics. Apologetics, it's almost viewed by them as almost like mental gymnastics, to try to you don't know what you believe and you're kind of backtracking now so you can make yourself look like you have it somewhat figured out. But really apologetics, the purest definition of the word is just to give a defense. So atheists, if they're to defend their belief, what you can say it's a lack of belief. If you're to defend why your lack of belief has good, why you have good reason to lack of belief, you're giving an apologetic for your belief or the lack thereof, So either way, everyone in some form, everyone's an apologist. Well, it depends on what you are defending, but everyone is an apologist essentially.
Right. And I know when I first, came to believe in God and everything, a lot of the initial pushback I got, who I kind of bumped heads with first was sort of the new atheist crowd. And one thing that kind of came up is this, in fact, I'd like to address it a little bit, is this idea of scientism, that, we get all of our answers from science and that God can't be, observed. We have no empirical evidence or proof of God in that sense. And so I think it's really important to distinguish that, natural theology is a philosophical, metaphysical type of argument. We're looking at, the philosophical implications of the empirical evidence and not. And so what are your thoughts on that? Because I know a lot of, the new atheist community will ask for this scientific evidence for God. So how would you kind of respond to that?
Yeah. So when I first hear their argumentation, I can see where they're coming from. T-Jump, really, his epistemology is strong on this, how science is the best tool we have to discern imagination from reality, right? He's not saying that's the only thing you can use, but it's the only tool we know of that works, right? And he also engages in philosophy. So I understand where some of them come from, but at that same time, a lot of the rejection is just a misrepresentation. Again, a lot of it comes down to misrepresentation, but if you let's say you just grant God exists, right? And the audience listening, you grant that God exists just for the argument's sake, right? And as far as a Christian God, he would be immaterial. God would be immaterial. So if God was immaterial, science studies the material. Even if God did exist, science would never get you to God. The closest it would ever get you is exactly what Travis is really interested in, natural theology, and that's really what we do. But scientism as a pure form, how science is the only means to knowledge, it doesn't work even if you do grant God. And then also a lot of people point this out, and I'll just go ahead just so if there's someone who doesn't see this already pointed out, is that the statement that science is the only way we have the knowledge, that statement can't be proved by science. So it's just simply a self-defeating argument, or a self-defeating worldview. Not worldview, I'd say ideology.
Right. And a lot of pushback I get too is like I've heard, like the argument with religious experience. Well,
Hmm.
it could be the case that humans evolved in such a way that these neuropathic signals in the brain and everything are just kind of geared towards agency. But
Yeah.
I think what needs to be kind of established, like with this idea of scientism, verificationism, is the metaphysical underpinning of science. Because
Hmm.
it's not like we're
Yeah.
trying to posit God in processes, but the explanation of why there are those processes in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I'm glad you covered it because I didn't cover that. But
But yeah, because in fact, that's one thing I've thought about too. Is like, well, how do I know it's just not all in my head
yeah. Hmm.
and everything? And I think that if you're a proponent of something like theistic evolution or
Hmm.
even design, but for now I'll just stick to like a theistic evolution.
Yeah.
Well, it seems reasonable to me that if God did exist,
Hmm.
that He would guide the evolutionary process in such a way that moral agents could develop in such a way that they would come to know him through their mental processes. So it's
Yeah.
like, so do you see? We can't just assume our conclusion. We have to think about the
Mhm.
metaphysical underlying of it because that's a very common objection I hear from the new
Yeah,
atheists.
exactly. And you brought up the theistic evolution, not as far as the academic history of atheism or like the rejection of God, because they have sometimes very formulated arguments against God. Um, but as far as like the I'm gonna say layman, that's not like a derogatory term. I'm just saying like the people who have like non non academics, Um, I don't know why, but historically, like just in the past, not historically, the past like 100 years, it seemed that it's always just been evolution versus creation, evolution versus creation. Either you believe in God and you're a creationist or you don't. Um, I just wanted to point this out that theistic evolution, you can, as long as you, that's not, evolution isn't like a defeater against Christianity. That's why I thought it was so silly how people will use evolution as an argument against God's existence, which is like God could have guided the evolutionary process. So I'm glad you pointed that out.
Oh, absolutely. And I see we have quite a few comments in the live chat, and
Mhm.
we'll get to those in just a bit. But you know, one thing, an approach I've taken, as far as like theistic evolution and everything, is that I kind of take a mix of old Earth creation and with evolutionary
Mhm.
creationism. Like I think it's reasonable to say that given the local fine tuning, because you have the cosmic fine tuning and then you have the local fine tuning, and I think the local fine tuning is designed in such a way that the you have sort of a process structuralism going on. But I'm of the view that
Mhm.
God also sees inherent value in life, and so that there's like de novo creations too. So I think there's kind of
Mhm.
both at play there.
Yeah.
But let's see. Okay, so what I was, we're talking about the new atheists and everything. Now, what I thought is much more substantial from the atheist community is like philosophical atheology. So this is going to get into issues of like arguments from evil, divine hiddenness, and everything. What are your thoughts on theistic responses from that? Like
Like divine hiddenness, problem of evil, stuff like that.
right, right. What are some of your favorite like atheologians and maybe the responses to those atheologians?
Yeah. So for me, let's say the problem of evil is what you're dealing with. Let's say it's like intellectually, like I'm addressing with it. I would say that one to point out that um, the common problem of evil, like the formulated version of it,
Hmm.
it's there's no actual like contradiction between the existence of God and the evil. All you would like William Craig points this out, and a lot of atheists would disagree with this, which is fine.
Hmm.
Um, but William Craig points out that all you would need is a sufficient reason to allow the evil, and it's not like self-contradictory. So it's not like an argument against God. Now there are other formulated arguments from the problem of evil, which I do need to. I went to David Paulman has, which of course he has. He's always reading, but David
Our
Paulman, I
heretic
really need to
friend.
read. Yeah, I really need to read like very like the strongest version of it against theism, so I can see what the strongest version of the problem of evil is, so we can address it. Divine hiddenness.
Yeah.
As far as that, I haven't necessarily like looked into that a whole lot. One thing I would say is that if you do grant that God exists, then like I think like again like a lot of atheists may like think that this is like cringy or whatever, but I would say the resurrection is like the biggest example of God coming down to man. And if you can defend that, then that would I think would help, at least as far as help the theistic side. And I'm still like, everyone's still researching their own beliefs. I may not
Oh,
use
sure.
that. I may, you know, who knows, like we're all, I think that if you value truth and you search for truth, you will have your beliefs change, and you should, so I'm still researching that as far as divine hiddenness, but that's what I would go to.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think we have sort of an obligation to be truth seekers and to kind of let reason and evidence fall, take us, where it takes us. And I think that's actually honoring to God and part of loving God with all your heart, mind,
Mhm.
soul, and strength and everything. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that. We did have a comment that I thought was interesting, like with
Mhm.
regard to the cumulative case, and I'd like to
Yeah.
get your view on it. And he's Titan's basically saying that you don't feel the Bayesian nature of the cumulative case has issues in that it doesn't present any one piece of evidence that is itself conclusive. So it's kind of like this idea of, well,
Yeah.
do you see a weakness, in that
Yeah.
aspect?
Me, honest, I don't, and the reason is one thing I would have to ask for clarification is when he says it's not of evidence, piece of evidence that is itself conclusive. I would have to ask what is his standard to which he would accept a view? Like, what is his criteria as far as what becomes conclusive? Because that can be very subjective, and
Sure.
sometimes we can get a very unrealistic conclusion, or a very unrealistic standard, which is certainty. Which you can have knowledge without certainty, um, which is knowledge is a justified true belief. So you can believe something rationally and not have complete certainty. There's many beliefs we all hold that we're not for certain of. Now, as far as the Bayesian nature of it, um, I feel like the legal system is a good example, which a lot of he may want to push back and say, well, our legal system is like an awful example because it's itself has problems, which that's fine that he said if you were to say that, but the legal system, there's usually not one piece of evidence that just condemns one person. Usually it's a cumulative case. I don't think I would have to ask him, is a cumulative case somehow, is that not very satisfying for him? Like something can be true and would a cumulative case be a good justification for a belief at any point? That's what I would ask.
Right.
He may want to comment to respond to that, but if it is,
Yeah.
and I would say that it's not. Uh, I wouldn't say it has issues with it. It may not satisfy your criteria of knowledge or
Mhm.
justification, but I wouldn't say it has complete issues, like fundamentally.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know for myself, I actually find it more convincing because I
Mm.
actually prefer the more modest abductive sense that, well, this
Yes.
is best explained and by theism. This is best explained by theism. Then you have like as a larger whole, you see all of these points of evidences, that we see in reality, that theism would offer the best explanation for it. So ironically, I kind of find that convincing.
Yeah, I do want to say this. He just commented. He said, by conclusive, I mean it's self-decisive or convincing, or not convincing, like self-decisive. So by the self-decisive, I mean like I would say like if it seems there's a question he had earlier about in the future or after this question, how nobody asked for scientific evidence, or he talks about science. So coming from that, I would say that science uses in very inductive, like Richard Swinburne's book, The Existence of God. It's very used Bayesian theory to calculate the probability of theism versus atheism. And that's induction is what we use in the core law. It's what we use in science. Is what we use. Like a lot of times, there's no one thing that just sets in. Like there's just one like piece of evidence that just completely just like sends home this one belief. Now, maybe that coupled with other evidences, but usually there's not one piece of evidence that, because there always could be that what if, what if this, and it's really it comes down to your epistemology and what would satisfy you as far as knowledge. But I wouldn't go as far as to say the cumulative case is completely just you should outright reject it, because there's many beliefs I'm sure he has
Hmm.
that are as a result of a cumulative case. And then he would have to say that the cumulative case is not sufficient standard of evidence to say that it's a bad way to argue for God. And I could agree with him that, yeah, he may not prefer that. And it would be better to have one piece of evidence. But to say that, I don't think maybe he's outright saying this, but if he were to say the cumulative case approach, that wouldn't count as justification. I would say that I would just have to disagree with them on that.
Sure. And I kind of like to touch on the moral argument because there's one more issue he brought up that I think is worthy of addressing because it is a common misconception about like what, when we argue for God as the best explanation of objective morality. And he says that theistic belief and morality are utterly unrelated. Many theists behave immorally. Many atheists are very moral. And so what are your thoughts on this? How we kind of need to clear up this misconception that we're not saying atheists can't be moral.
Yeah. So like, as far as morality, I think there is a big misunderstanding. And a part of that may be because, again, Christians, we actually aren't standing up for our belief, which is why, like we talked about this earlier, why apologetics is so important. But morality, we're not saying that atheists can't be moral. And we're not saying that Christians can't be immoral. There's Christians that are there's atheists that are more moral than some Christians. Sure. And to the atheists, I get what they're coming from. They may say that seems like if Christianity, one of the main beliefs within Christianity, is that Christ can change your life. Christ wants you to call you to a more holy life, but yet Christians aren't doing that. How do you ransom that? Or how do you rescue that? And I would say that it's just a misunderstanding. Atheists and Christian both can live moral lives. The only difference between theists and atheists is that I believe that Christians, or the theists, not even Christian, theists, they can ground their morality in something objective. Atheists, they have no objective grounding for their morality, and that's why I would say theistic belief is very vital to morality, because at that point, if morality is subjective, it ends up being just either one, different views, or one, it's societal concepts. So if the society as a whole believes something's immoral or moral, then it becomes moral or moral. Or let's say that evolutionary, like in the evolutionary context, if it's the best way of survival, then it becomes moral. And I think these all have problems with it. Because, for example, let's say you use society as a standard for morality, which would be a subjective standard because society is changing. Let's say Hitler won the war. This is an example. It's very radical example, but it really helps people see the point. Let's say Hitler did win the war, and he believed, like one superior race, and all of society, was infected with this idea. Would it then become moral because society as a whole accepts it? Or if it was, let's say that it increased survivability, or it was the best choice in the evolutionary context, that we had the view of one superior race, does it then become moral? Does what Hitler did then become justified? I would say no, because the theist says that morality is grounded in something objective. It's not saying you have to believe in God to be moral. It's just saying that you have to have something objective to ground that, and the theist has that.
Right. And by the way, I'd like to welcome my good friend Ethan of Spartan Theology, who is not a big fan of natural theology. He's just kidding.
Well, I'm glad he came on to hear us out.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as we kind of look, what would you say is probably your least favorite argument for the existence of God? Because, we're kind of talking about like the kalam and, the contingency, moral argument, I think are good, but I think there's also some that are pretty bad. So what would you say is probably your least favorite argument for God?
My least favorite argument is usually arguments from experience, not because experience, because Cameron Bertuzzi says that, he said this more recently on his Facebook, that experience is a very good argument for God. I'm not saying it's like a bad argument for God, but I just don't like to use it because a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with atheists, it doesn't really, there's like a disconnect between that. Because like in a way, we can sometimes, I'm not saying this is what the arguments from experience do, but sometimes it can be perceived that you're arguing from a bias. So it's almost like as intuitive to you, but that doesn't help the atheist or the other person, your interlocutor, who you're talking to. And also another reason I don't always like experience arguments is, again, it can be subjective. It can be very subjective, and it's hard to be able to demonstrate. It's like William Lane Craig says, you can know what you believe. But to demonstrate it is a different thing. And I think arguments from experience are sometimes hard to demonstrate. And yes, you can be made to make an argument for God. But as far as the argument for like the Christianity, it'd be a little harder to make an argument from experience, as far as like, because there's many other religions who have arguments from experience. Like more Muslims would say that they have religious experiences. Buddhists would say they have religious experiences. So if you're trying to argue for Christianity, sometimes it's hard to kind of have your worldview heard in like the pool of all the other accounts. It can be used to argue for God, but I personally don't like to use it as much.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Like, I think for me as a Christian, like one of the most important things is the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, and
Yes,
I think, having a relationship and knowledge of God, through my senses is to me very good evidence, such that I can know that God exists, that Christ died for my sins, and things like that. But it's like it's for me, and it's like sort of subjective, because I mean it's like good luck trying to convince an atheist that the Holy Spirit tells me I'm saved, so therefore Christianity is true. So
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's this
definitely.
go ahead.
Oh no, please go ahead.
So like Titan, he had another comment. He says, why does failure to believe due to lack of evidence? Which I want to try to address these comments because he is being engaged, which I appreciate him like having a different viewpoint, coming
Okay,
on your show to
sure.
talk. He says,
Yeah.
why does failure to believe due to lack of evidence require anyone to defend it? And I would say that so I was having trouble kind of get to what he was saying. He's like, why does failure to believe due to lack of evidence require someone to defend it? I don't know if he's talking from the atheist perspective or the Christian, because I did mention that a lot of Christians, the goal of my channel is to help Christians have confidence in the faith and know how to defend it, and how people view apologetics as like almost like a mental gymnastics. But I would say that let's say that something is true, something is true, and you would have good reason to believe it is true. I think you'd be morally responsible, and also just if you are intellectually honest to defend that view. So I don't think that defending a view has anything to do with the credibility of that view at all. Just because of you, maybe it's he's saying if God exists, why would God need defending? One is that if he's granting God exists, we're commanded to, but also whether or not you defend a view has nothing to do with whether or not it needs defending. Like I don't think a view, just because you have to stand up for a view, because at that point, really anything could be seen as incredible just because you need to defend it.
Right. And so, let's see. If you wanted to address some more of his comments, he did have one that I thought was interesting.
There was a follow up he had. We can address that. He said, if you have something you consider likely to be true, 60% true, and something else 70% towards the same conclusion.
Right. This will kind of get into the issue of, I think, the cumulative case.
Yeah.
So how would you respond to that?
If you have something you consider likely to be true, 60% of true, and something else 70% towards the same conclusion, how do you become more than 70% convinced? So he's kind of saying, let's say you have two different views and you're trying to explain this phenomenon. There's a phenomenon. How do you explain that? Like for example, the
sort of like a
resurrection.
likelihood comparison.
Yeah.
Right?
So there's the minimal facts approach. It's facts that both sides of the aisle, both sides agree on. And the phenomenon is the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. How do you explain all of this? 500 witnesses. How do you explain the empty tomb? The fact that he was actually crucified but was seen after. How do you explain that? Atheists will try to explain it, and the Christians will explain it and say how the resurrection of Jesus is actually the best explanation for it. He says, let's say you have these two views. How do you? And one of them, the probability is like 60% likely true. One and the other one's like 70%. So they're both like are over 50%. So they both would be you could be justified in believing them.
Sure.
How can you be more than 70%? One could be just one go to like the fundamental source of it, go back to the evidence and see which evidence more likely supports one or the other. It seems very simple, but I think that would help. Or also maybe to use the Occam's razor, maybe that would help to shave off the stuff you don't need,
that's
the most
what
simplest form. Because sometimes the most simplest argument, the most simplest I'm trying to think explanation is usually the best explanation. And if he values science, he would agree with that. One book I would recommend to him, or at least to look into, is that Richard Swinburne's. You don't have to read all of his books because his books are very thick, but maybe just look in like his lecture, at least one lecture, and see what he does. His viewpoint is because he's very much so in the inductive camp, and he uses the Bayesian theory to look at the probability, and he will address most of that. So if he's has problems with that and he is open to it, maybe just watch a lecture by him and just see his viewpoint on that. I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the Bayesian arguments too, and sort of like, just the abductive inference to the best explanation. Like, I actually tend to favor those arguments more than some of the deductive arguments, just because they're more modest. And so I find that, more convincing in its
Yeah.
modesty. But so I guess, as we kind of close out, is there anything you'd like to like leave the audience with?
One thing, since the whole view of this is apologetics, just to help maybe challenge people who maybe challenging people who are thinking about getting apologetics, or maybe they don't believe it's biblical, or they don't like using natural theology, Spartan theology. I'm just joking, but as far as that, I would say one, I want to make a just really quick, just make the biblical case for it, because we showed like
Yes,
logically
please.
how it's good, and maybe we can have a future discussion like just anti-intellectualism, because that's a whole episode. Maybe I can have you. I'd like to have you on my channel as well.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
the just to show in First Peter 3:15, it commands us to give an answer, and the word answer definition is the word apologia, which means to give a um, reasoned defense as if in a court of law. So we're called to reasonably give a defense of our beliefs. And part of that entails studying. The Bible says, study to show thyself approved. And in 2 Corinthians 10, it says we're supposed to tear down strongholds that hinder people from coming to the knowledge of Christ. That involves engaging with different worldviews, different ideas, concepts. And then in Luke, we're commanded to love God with our mind, which is part of that is studying what we believe intellectually. Because a lot of people, we do a great job at loving God with our heart, our soul. We
Mhm.
um, when we sing, like a lot of Christians, sadly, when you ask them why they're Christian, they would say, well, when I'm in church and I sing the hymns, it really speaks to my soul. And that's great. Like that's not to take away from that, but that has nothing to do with the credibility or the actual, like the 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 truth of whether or not Christian belief is true. I think at Christians, we need to actually, like, you know do what we're called to do, and actually intellectually understand and be able to reasonably know what we believe. And that's part of growing spiritually. A lot of and like I said, the last thing I'll say is, a lot of times the intellectual life is divorced from spirituality, when really the intellectual life is a part of spirituality. And we can have a whole nother discussion on that, but I just wanted to really point out the biblical case for it, for any Christians who are interested in it.
Right. And, for me, the way I sort of approach this is, my relationship with Christ, and knowing, the inner presence of God and everything. That's actually why I remain a Christian. And then I think, when it comes to natural theology and theistic arguments,
Yeah.
and then philosophical, arguments from atheology, I think, when we look at all the facts of reality, combined, and, on their own merits, I think theism offers the best explanation to the given
Mhm.
facts that we see in reality. And so I kind of view theism as more of a grand theory. So,
Mhm.
I kind of separate the fact that, I have my spiritual life. And then when I look at natural theology, I think the evidence is just tipped in
Yeah, so
favor of
it's like the
theism.
justification of the belief, which David
Right.
Paulman's like great for epistemology, talking about that. One thing, Spartan theology, your friend, he said,
Yeah.
when you're doing natural theology, how do you know it's God you're talking about? Don't we have to start at the only point God truly intersected our reality, Jesus Christ? So I agree with him, though. The best example to look at where God intersected our reality, that intersection that we can look at to see, is Jesus Christ. And I agree with that. The only way I would say natural theology would help in actually getting that, because he values that point, as all Christians should. But the
Mhm.
only natural theology can help that. It's like the best example is Braxton Hunter, what he with Trinity Radio. He gives this example, which I love. Um, let's say that you're walking down like the street and you have no knowledge of any organization, as far as like NASA or anything like that. You have no knowledge of any organization. You have no idea space travel, like you can actually like leave Earth. And then you
Right.
hear that someone said, like just last week we put 2 American people on the moon. Like they were on the moon last week, and we brought them back safely. Like, if you never had any concept of NASA or anything like that, you would, yes, you could believe it, and you would have good reason to believe it. Maybe if you could maybe see pictures or stuff like that, that would be good reason to believe it, right? But I feel like you would, Spartan would have to admit, if you had prior knowledge of an organization like NASA that has the power, that has the ability, and has the will to send someone to the moon, I feel like he would have to say that at least helps that would at least help them. That would at least help the view to say that
Oh,
they were on the moon. And same with Christ. We have the resurrection we can look at. And yeah, the resurrection can be used to show that God exists, right? But I think that if you were to start the other way and show that God already exists and that he has the power and the
mm,
will and the ability to be able to raise Jesus from the dead, I think that would actually help the case of the resurrection. So I don't think that just because
yeah,
you valued, I don't think that just because you value the resurrection is a defeater of natural theology. Natural theology can
right.
aid in that.
Yeah, and Ethan and I have talked about this, and I get where he's coming from. That we need to have a high Christology,
Mhm.
and I would even agree that Jesus Christ is our starting point, and so I agree with that, and I think in light of that, these various facts we see in reality are more probable or more readily
Mhm.
explained by theism as sort of a grand metaphysical
Mhm.
theory. And so, but the thing, one thing I would kind of question Spartan on is that the this rejection of natural theology. It would seem that like as a theist, you would almost be bound to say that yeah, I think the universe and Earth are like designed for
Mhm.
embodied moral agents. Yes, I think God initiated the creation. It seems like
Mhm.
I don't see how you would get around denying those
Mhm.
facts and yet still maintaining the truth of that. So I'm a little bit confused on how that would
Yeah.
sort of play out.
Yeah, and he did clarify. He said, "I just think when we start with that natural theology, we fit God into our ideas. When we start with Christ, we actually come to know the true God." And we can disagree on this, which is fine. But as far as that's fine that you would say that, but I don't think that you can say that like maybe you personally want to engage in natural theology, but I think that you could not engage in it and still see the merit and still see the point, of why it would be used. And then also think about again, 2 Corinthians 10, if our goal is to tear down those strongholds, sometimes, and you may ask yourself, sometimes could I use natural theology
Mhm.
um, as an argument? And also, the resurrection of Jesus would count as natural theology, I think. Would it not? Like,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
it's
So,
evidentialism. And yeah, so the thing with what Spartan's saying is in light of that, I think it would be very difficult for
mm,
Christian theists to deny that, like, let's say, the laws of nature are geared towards embodied moral agents to come to know and love
mm,
God, or that, God is the best explanation of why there is physical reality. Um, I don't see how you can kind of distinguish those two. I think one kind of requires the other, but and we can just agree to disagree on that because he does say I don't totally reject
yeah,
natural
yeah.
theology. It
And I'm
just
sure
shouldn't
he
be.
didn't. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it just shouldn't be the starting point. For me, it is the starting point, and it
mm,
led me to Christ. But I mean, I
yeah,
can totally respect like the other way. Like, hey, well, let's start with Christ, who is God
exactly.
incarnate, and
Yeah.
all revelation, should be given that way. So, yeah, totally want to respect that. I think he has a good point, and I'll tell you what really helped my faith out, and I do want to plug this. I know we're coming up at the hour mark, but uh, welcome Tim Howard, and he's saying that
Yes.
Swinburne all the way. And reading Swinburne has had a tremendous impact on my faith. Like
Yeah.
when I started, because I kind of went from like like pop level apologetics to more like philosophical theism and like the philosophy of religion, and it just tremendously boosted my confidence
Mm,
in theism. Although it kind of corrected some, and I'm not. There are some beliefs that it changed, but others it
yes.
very much
Mm,
strengthened. And I think Swinburne has one of the best approaches for things like the fine tuning for like the resurrection and his approach. I think he has one of the best theodicies to like the problem of evil and animal suffering and everything. So what would your take be? What's your take on Swinburne and his approach?
yeah. So I was first introduced to Swinburne by I think it was Kyle. I can't
Kyle
remember his last name. Yeah, yeah.
Haller.
Yeah. So I recommend I read it, and it really just like I think it's a great read. It talks about pretty much the nature of explanation. Let's say we have this
Yeah.
phenomenon in the beginning of the universe. How are we best? That's a phenomenon. We need to explain it. Which worldview best explains that. And he actually sets up, he steals man a lot of atheistic arguments. He's not straw manning. He steel man's all very good, strong atheistic arguments, theistic arguments, and then he shows how they deal with each other. And then he uses the Bayesian theory to calculate the probability of theism or atheism, which is very good. And it does have to do with the cumulative case approach. But I think that's very helpful. And I think Swinburne is I love Swinburne. Some of his stuff might be harder to read, and for me it was harder to read. But it's very rewarding.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously there are some areas I disagree with. I'm not a big fan of his model of God and everything. But I've learned so much from people like Swinburne, Rasmussen, and his how reason leads to God with his contingency argument. And what I've noticed, my faith really boosted when I started studying, more philosophy of religion with that aspect of natural theology, because it's what I think is more powerful, or the most powerful, is to really just steel man the arguments to the contrary and explain why those arguments don't work and why theism offers a better explanation, which is exactly what I think Swinburne does. And to me, I find that very compelling.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think this has been a great talk. I think natural theology is I think it's really important. And to kind of echo with what Spartan theology was saying, if it's not, it doesn't. I don't think it has to be our starting point. I think we can start with Christ. I think that's kind of dependent on the specific person. So I would be totally fine with saying, let's start with Christ, who is God incarnate, and all revelation flows from that. And hey, that explains why we have all these facts. So I mean, I'd be fine with something like that. Yeah, absolutely. And coming up tomorrow, as a matter of fact, at 6 p.m. Central, we're going to have Ethan of Spartan Theology on here, who's going to be he's going to be discussing his theological journey and how he's kind of made some changes in his theology. And so that should be really fun. And Jadon, I want to thank you once again for coming on. And
thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone needs to check out Confident Faith, his YouTube channel. I think you have a Facebook page, don't you?
Yes, I have Facebook, Instagram, and the YouTube, of course. And I have a website too. I just started just because I like to have that hub that you can go to all of them, which I'll give you a link. You can link that in the description in the future. But
yeah, absolutely. And if you want to put it in the comments, that would be great too. And I'll post it on here and everything. And so I want to thank you for coming on. I think this has been really good, and look forward to having you back on in the near future.
Yep.
All right. Take care, and God bless everyone.